at the University of Illinois in 1970. And Dr. Myers has done archaeological research and studied Native American art in the Amazon Basin and the Great Plains. He's taught courses in Native American art and anthropology for 10 years. He is co-curator of the exhibit we have here at the Museum of Nebraska History, entitled Beadwork Masterpieces of Native American Bandolier Bags of the Prairie and Lakes. And this is also the topic of his talk today. I now present Dr. Tom Myers.
Well, thank you very much. I am pleased to have the opportunity to talk about this Native American art with you today. But before I begin, I'd like to recognize the contributions of Will Dooley, who really did a tremendous amount in helping me prepare for this talk, in helping prepare for the exhibit, and identifying some of the photographs that we've taken out of and creating many books, and just generally providing a great deal of insight to the whole proposition. Now, when we're talking about Native American art, one of the great difficulties is that we are generally presented with an object, a piece of art, with very little context. If we're lucky, in many cases we don't even have this, we know when an item entered a museum, so we know that it was at least made before this date. And so one of the great things that we have to worry about when we're talking about Native American art, and the development of Native American art, is the context and any kind of information that we can reconstruct about it, or reconstruct about the use of the object. And so beginning our talk about bandolier bags, I'll begin with this painting by Benjamin Rush of the death of Wolfe on the plains of Abram outside of Montreal. Benjamin Rush painted this painting in 1770. And I particularly want to call your attention to this individual down here on the left. He's Native American down here on the left. Uncertain, of course, as to exactly which tribe he is down here. And as we come in on him, you'll see this very early portrait of a beaded bag, at least. Now, we talk about bandolier bags, and something of a definition is in order. Really, we're talking about elaborately beaded, elaborately ornamented bags. Usually, a bag that is beaded with a broad strap, very frequently ornamented. Now, this is a very early example of a beaded bag, at least. And I want to bring several things to your attention here. First of all, the material of which it's made. Now, it seems to be red wool, and I will move ahead. As it happens, this bag was part of Benjamin Rush's props, and it worked its way into the British Museum many years later. So we not only have this painting of the bag as pretty much as it looked in its original condition, but we have the bag as it came into the British Museum. This is in better condition, so I want to use this as the starting point of talking at least about it. We have basically a red bag here. Now, what that red bag is it's going to be wool. It's going to be wool that was taken from cloth and then rewoven by the Indians into this form. The red wool seems to have been a trade good which replaced buffalo hair, which was traded all the way from Illinois country through the Great Lakes, down Lake Huron, or down the Ottawa River into the east. And so we're talking about a replacement with European trade goods of what was apparently a very ancient kind of material that was being used by the Indians. Secondly, we want to talk about these beads which are woven into the fabric. Those, of course, are trade goods, but they replaced beads that were made from shell on the coast of the Atlantic coast, or sometimes shell beads that were brought in all the way from the Pacific Ocean and traded to the peoples of the East United States. In the structure of this bag, I want you to look at the broad beaded strap. I want you to notice the drops along in here where we have very early examples of tin cones, which we find on Plains Indian materials all the way into the the 2005s. And down here we have a series of drops in tin cones again with what seems to be red wool coming out from underneath those things. These are some essential features of the early northern bandolier bag. And I want to keep in mind as we move to this picture here of the piece as it exists in the British Museum today. Of course, one of the things that we have to be terribly concerned about as we look at paintings and use paintings for documentation is the degree to which the artist has taken artist's license with the piece. Here we can see that Benjamin Rush followed quite faithfully what his original piece was all about. We have a little bit more information now about the decoration that was on the strap here, and see how this is all woven here together. The same kinds of designs that you get on the bag itself. And again, you get this line of drops that we saw here, and another line of ornamental drops down in this way. So all those things are fundamental to our information about what I refer to as the northern style, or the origins of the northern style of bandolier bag. We have another very distinct style of bandolier bag, which I refer to as a southern style, which you'll see being worn here by this Indian Cherokees. And these are particularly noted for some of the Cherokees. One of the features that we'll note on this bag here is this drop in here. As it happens, this painting was done in 1826 when the various Indians from the southeastern tribes were visiting Washington. It's from the McKinney Hall Portrait Gallery. And they were coming to visit Washington in 1826 in preparation of their being forced westward into Indian country to the west. As it turns out, this is western Missouri, Kansas, and of course Oklahoma. But really it was Kansas in the early days. It was Indian territory. And Indian Kansas seems to have been a hotbed for the mixing of different tribes and for the development of some quite distinctive artistic styles. It has never received the historical importance that it probably had in the development of Native American art in this period. There are a number of these individuals that are wearing bags of this sort. Here we see again a bandolier strap, very much like the one we saw before, the bag, and notice the pointed flap on this pocket here. That kind of pointed flap is one of the characteristics of the southern style of bandolier bag. Notice this very decorated strap here, and notice how it's offset. There's just a corner tie or linking the bag to the strap. And also the ornamental drops in here, beads going up this way. In many ways, it's very much like the bag, the northern bag, but that diagonal flap is the distinctive characteristic. We see lots of Cherokee wearing these bags at the time. This is the southern style bag. We know that it was well established by 1826, but an interesting point is that at the same period of time, they were also painting a number of Chippewa, the northern people from northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, as we know them today, who became famous for the bandolier bag manufacture in the upper Great Lakes. But we see only one possible bandolier bag in all the individuals that were painted in this 1826 period. And here's a bag which is from a museum collection, completely undocumented, but which is very much the same kind of bag as the people were wearing in 1826. You'll notice the offsets here, not quite so offset as some of the bags. Notice this very elaborate flap here. Notice the elaborations on the strap. A completely undocumented bag. It's not the same as those we see, but yet it's clearly the same kind of thing that we're seeing from 1826 in the McKinney Hall Portrait Gallery. Now, there are several bags of this same sort of general characteristics. Here we see the bag completely offset at the corners. We see a couple of cloth drops rather than the fringes that we saw on the other bag. But again, we see this thing. We see the curliness of some of these ornaments in here. Now, that bag calls it Seminole, or that legend calls it Seminole. And this brings one of the great questions of how do we know what we know when it comes to Native American art. And the answer is, it's very largely a by guess and by God proposition. Archaeologists, natural scientists, define a species with reference to a particular individual or to a group of items that was excavated together from a single archaeological site or an individual specimen. That is to say, there is a standard of comparison. No such standard of comparison exists in Native American art. What you have is a rather loose, kind of best guess, not tied to any data, but something that kind of conforms to what a number of people are thinking about, but most specifically, not tied to any data. What we need for serious studies of Native American art is we need to go back and we need to look specifically and define collections, which will provide standards of comparison, rather than these rather loose-jointed things that exist in Native American art as it's being studied today. So don't pay too much attention to this. We can kind of accept the 1940 date because now we have a standard of comparison against those bags that are being worn in the McKinney Hall Portrait Gallery. Another bag, a similar sort of thing. You notice some floral designs beginning to creep under this. The large floral designs in here, but again, you notice the offset straps, you notice the flap. The same sorts of things are coming up. Now, one of the things you might notice is I lifted a lot of these photos from American Indian Art Magazine. These items are in private hands. We don't know when they entered the museums. There's a very poor collecting history on these things, at least available to the public. The individual collector who's going to lay out $20,000 or $30,000 to buy this thing may get some provenance, but the rest of us don't have that opportunity. And here's one more item, sort of in the same general mode, and you begin to get an idea of what the range of variation is for these bags that I would look to be in the early group, 1820s, 1830s kind of a proposition. Now, the next bag that I'm going to show you is this bag here. You notice that we now have the flap. It's just a little bit truncated at the bottom, not much of a bother to me, but this business in here is fully beaded in the background. Now, this bag is particularly important for two reasons. First of all, it is here. It is upstairs. And secondly, it is the only bag that I know of that has some specific documentation to it. According to the documentation that's in the exhibit, it was Shawnee traded to the Pawnee and collected at Fort Kearny in 1850. We've got a real date. We don't have manufacturers. We know that it was traded from the Shawnee to the Pawnee, but who did the Shawnee get it from? We don't know. But we have a date. And we can use this as a standard of comparison for a number of other bags. The next couple of pictures here, I'm going to show you the sides of the bags. Notice that, again, you get the same sort of elaboration across here, the full beaded background. Notice the sinuous vine up here with the leaves coming off of it. You can see the bag down in here. You can see some drops over in here. This is one side of the bag. Now, one of the features that's characteristic of these bags is that the other, you get up to the top, and it's entirely different design on the opposite side of the bag. So that's another one of the features that we can be thinking about for these Southern style bags around 1850. Now, we're no longer in the Southeast, we're in Indian Kansas. Indian Kansas, Indian country, it includes the Osage, it includes the Shawnee, it includes the Delaware, a northeastern group that were brought into it and who were at least a possible manufacturer for the bag that we saw in the Benjamin Rush painting. You have a number of tribes. The Trail of Tears led to Oklahoma and Kansas. You have Sauk and Fox brought into this region. You have Potawatomi brought in. There's just a whole lot of tribes that are brought into this region that are fairly close to one another. And one of the things that was developing during the 1850s and 1860s and the 1870s was a series of county fairs in which the Indians not only of any particular area, but in nearby areas would come to the fairs. And there would be lots of opportunity to gain artistic insights from other peoples. And the artistic insights and the artistic ideas that one Indian borrowed from another Indian is absolutely characteristic of what we can expect from any artistic style, is that it's going to be a continually evolving style. And if you find that somebody has a good idea, You latch onto it and make it your own and incorporate it in your own artistic work. And this is precisely the way European artists have worked. The difference between European artists and Native American artists in a lot of ways is that we have some pretty darn good dating on European artists. If you've ever watched Antiques Roadshow, you'll notice them pointing to the Makers Market. So, yeah, they made that between 1749 and 1752. We don't have those kinds of guide marks in Native American art. Here's another bag of the same sort. They say this is 1830. Maybe, but what's their standard of comparison? We have a standard of comparison now because we have that bag upstairs. You see the same sort of thing going on. Truncated flap. In this case, we have some birds. Maybe they're eagles. They may be American eagles. With a shield in the center. You see this same sort of vine creeping up here. You see that the design on this side is entirely different. You see 3 drops on the sides. You see the offset. All of these things are familiar to us now as we've begun to look at another series of bags. Another bag, we're talking about essentially the same sort of thing. You begin to see these variations on the theme. Once again, sold by one of the art galleries. These things are in private hands. Very few of them are in public hands. One of the very few in public hands is upstairs. I know of another one in the American Museum of Natural History. There must be some more around, but hey, it's real thin going. So the bag upstairs is very important. Drops, different designs on the sides, still floral. Interesting things about this kind of very elaborate bandolier bag is it dropped off pretty quickly in the Indian Kansas region. We don't really have much in the way of good dating, but all of the bags that we have that seem to be are like this are in pretty much the same style. They don't show a change that we would expect if the style continued later on. So somehow or another, these bags dropped out of the record. They ceased to be made as the people who had made them got interested in doing other things. But these floral designs, these big old floral designs here, the next place they show up is on the Kiowa cradle boards, the Kiowa cradle bags. And where did the Kiowa learn them? They learned them from Indian Kansas, and they're very likely the context of the state fairs or the county fairs in which these things were going on. It's amazing to think of Native American art being transmitted through county fairs. But that's the kind of thing that was happening. If you go back and look at some of the old newspaper accounts, there are some lovely newspaper accounts, this time now late from the 1920s, of the oil-rich Osage coming up to visit the Omaha powwows and lording it over the resident Omahas. And the Omahas still remember. So this kind of bag, you see, we're running, he goes to the valley, it says 1825. Yeah, maybe. You'll see the reasons that I say maybe. Let's look at something a little bit different. We're looking at a similar sort of bag now, and all of this group in here of this sort is called Delaware. You see it has many similar features, but like that first bag that we looked at in the Death of Wolf, notice this line of drops across here, a line of drops across here, not like anything we've been seeing from the southern bags in the last group of things we're looking at. We're looking at something that's very different. We lack the flap. We have offset straps. They're different on each side. We have these 3 things, but there are really some very significantly different features of these bags that are in the last group that we're looking at. And I wouldn't be terribly surprised if, in fact, Delaware were not a pretty good identification of these things. Same sort of thing. Here we can look at this again. Here we have red wool. Here we have the drops again, 3 drops off to the side, different colors or different designs over here, fully beaded across in here. You see, there's another bag, there's another characteristic which really falls onto quite a distinctive style. I want to shift back to the north now. This kind of bag is a kind of bag that's generally known as Upper Great Lakes. As you can see, it's in miserable shape, but we see some features on here we've been seeing before. This bag probably dates into the early 1800s. Collection data, not to be expected. You see this line of tin cones across here, another line of tin cones across here. You'll see an ornamented decorative field here, and you'll see a feature that we haven't seen before. And never mind too much the fact the lobe designs in here, but notice this large plain area above the decorated zone. We'll see a lot more of this, and you'll see this in some of the bags that we have on exhibit, which are exclusively northern-style bandolier bags. The strap, hard to see in here. It looks like nothing much, but there are some lines of quill work. It's kind of where you see orange, a little bit of orange and white right in here, and you can, if you get a little more closely, you can look at the lines of quill work. Maybe you can see it better from there than I can from here. But again, we're dealing with something with a very elaborately ornamented bag, an ornamented stripe. Here, just tied on. Nothing big, no big deal here. But these features that we saw on the northern-style bag clear back to the time of Wolfe, 1770. Now we get into a little bit much more of a modern bag. This again is right here, the Nebraska State Historical Society. You'll see this big panel up in here. They have, in this case, put a floral design on here. And notice the bilateral symmetry of this design. This is in character, pretty generally characteristic of the early bags of the northern area where they began to put on these floral designs. The symmetrical, bilaterally symmetrical characteristic generally is putting bags of this sort, and with some of these, some of the other features, we're putting, this is probably running on toward 1850, really quite early, but about the same time as the Shawnee, Delaware bags we were looking at before. But this is quite early in the history of the northern style of bandolier bag. Some other features you would want to note along here is notice the ornamentation along the side. Notice in this case wool drops. You see some ribbon work along in here on the side. This is probably the same kind of red wool weaving that you saw on the Benjamin Rush bag. And you'll notice the beads being actually woven there into the thread. This combination of green and red is characteristic of a lot of early pieces from the upper Great Lakes area, extending as far down as the Osage. Another what I think is a fairly early bag. You notice this area over in here again. Now it's plain. We've got a lot of wrapping around it. This has changed, though. This is now woven beadwork in here. And we want to look at this sort of feature of the X design. This again is a fairly early bag. We're probably talking something in the 1860s, 1870s. Notice I'm kind of avoiding tribal affiliation on this stuff. The more that I look at these things, the more problematic tribal affiliation becomes, because one person will make a bag. We have no idea who made the bag. These things are elaborate artistic pieces. They are the kinds of things that are often given away. And they will be preserved for fairly substantial periods of time. And in the giveaway, not only do we lose the identity of the individual artist who created it, we also lose the tribal affiliation of that individual, and it becomes really quite problematic. And what we need is we need a larger body of materials where we know what people were actually using at particular points in time. We need, I believe, more study of photographs. We have a couple in the exhibit here, a couple of early photographs dated to the 1850s, 1860s that we got from the Minnesota Historical Society that shows some Chippewa or Ojibwa, same tribe, slightly different pronunciation of the name, from northern Minnesota, who are wearing bags that are very much of the sort that we looked at last time. This seems to be a little bit later. This woven beadwork, but notice the big paneling around the sides. And notice also these tabs along in here are woven tabs. They bear no relationship to the design here, totally irrelevant. This has some relationship to the design on the other side, but once again we notice that the two sides of the flap are quite different. They're not the same design. Look at another bag here. Here again, we're looking at the same sort of thing. We've got some drops added up in here, not a terribly unusual feature. We see this kind of beadwork line on the edge here. We see the bilateral symmetry of this big panel up in here. I want to draw your attention to these designs in here. These are very frequently associated with the Chippewa or Ojibwa, and it may be only the Chippewa or Ojibwa that made them. It's called the beaver tail design, and is distinguished by these rather long open areas and then these sort of little diamond areas in here. If you look at the design structure on this bag again, you'll notice you're basically dealing with this kind of X construction. Once again, the tabs bear no relationship to this design, bear no relationship to this design, none here, none here. They're all really set up as individual pieces. This appears to be pretty much characteristic of a lot of northern bags. Very likely Chippewa Association, particularly because of this business across in here. And let me point out one other very, very important thing in the identification of Native American art. And that is that the Chippewa outnumber all other groups that were making bandolier bags by 10 or 20 to 1. Just as the Lakota outnumber the other Plains Indian tribes by 10 or 20 to 1. So the Chippewa outnumbers the group, other tribes in the upper Great Lakes. When it comes to identification, in general, that's very important. If you blindfold me and tell me that there's a piece of work from the upper Great Lakes on the table here, and I tell you that it's Chippewa, sight unseen, if it's a random selection, the chances are about 90% that I'm going to be correct. I can do the same thing with Lakota stuff in the Plains. Those two tribes were that dominant in their region. It is interesting that the Chippewa and Sioux were enemies for a century at least in the northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin areas, as the Chippewa pushed the Sioux westward. This is in part a push and in part a draw, because the Chippewa controlled access to the traders in the upper Great Lakes, and to a very large degree the Sioux were moving toward the traders in the Missouri Valley. So this is not only a push, it's a pull of the access to trade goods, which was very important here. But anyhow, getting back to the artistic work, you'll see we've got the red and green that we showed up before, and the number of features there. You'll recognize some of these things here. Oh, red and green, same sorts of designs here. This is a bag that's on exhibit out here and is in the University of Nebraska State Museum collection. Once again, you're looking at a woven business here, or no relationship between these. The designs up in here. You'll see kind of this X design. But you're finding a new feature in here. You're finding that this stuff is very clearly floral kinds of representation. These are leaves here, and look at the veining in the leaves. Now we're going to find the veining in the leaves as the Chippewa bags in particular, and those that follow the Chippewa, made a dramatic shift in the way they decorated bandolier bags, where they shifted from the woven bags here to a applique surface, much like the southern bags that we're looking at. So the broad areas are now decorated by applique, and that gives them the opportunity to institute much more flowing motifs than have been possible, or than is possible with this kind of weaving. So we're looking at a bag here that is probably dating about 1880, maybe into the early 1890s. We're looking at a bag that is still woven and is right at the end, I believe, of the era in which the Chippewa were doing their woven beadwork. Now, dating bags and any kind of Native American art is always a difficulty, because I just nailed that thing with that 1880, 1890 date. But you know, I'll bet that grandmothers were not doing the same kind of work as their granddaughters in 1890. So that you already have a considerable amount of fudge just simply by generations, by the granddaughter probably wanting to adopt a new style, the grandmother staying with what she was comfortable with. So dating of things gets to be very difficult, problematical, and we have only so very few things that we can really pin our dates on, just as we can have it difficult to our culture. And you see, we're introducing now the floral bags from the 1880s period, 1890s period. And you'll see a number of kinds of things that we've been looking at before, only now it's in floral kinds of decoration. This big panel up in here above the bag, floral panel. Now you see we're introducing asymmetric designs. You see the veining in here. See the big back panel here, some of the outline here, a little bit of zigzag work. Instead of bilaterally symmetrical designs, you have an asymmetrical design up in here. One thing that's particularly characteristic of the Chippewa is this kind of concentric fill that you see here, and these gradations of colors are all things that tend to identify things as Chippewa, if it weren't enough to sheer numerical superiority. Doing the same sort of thing here. We're developing the bilateral symmetry, a little bit of veining. You see the full coloring here, still have this panel. And as we move along, we find the same sort of things going on, but here we're moving back into something that we were looking at before. These are more like the Chippewa bags of the 1880s. But you'll see that there are some really different features. You still have this panel up in here. You have the bilateral symmetry here. But look at this design panel, which is now based upon the repetition of designs, and you get the same repetition of designs up in here. At one point along the line, we got smart enough, so we started folding, so you could look and see that the change of design is just a continuous design across in here, not the kind of change of design we're looking at before. And this kind of design here is really characteristic of the Winnebago. You find this on some of the older Winnebago photographs. You find this something in some of the bags that are in the museum, the American Museum of Natural History in New York. You'll find this on bags that here in the Historical Society. You'll find it in photographs. So we have a lot of documentation that associates this sort of thing with the Omo. You see here, 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 and the bilateral symmetry of the designs. Now we're still looking at bags that are probably late 19th, early 20th century. We still have these large panels here that don't have this business. But you notice this line across in here, we don't have the drops on here anymore, but you could see how the drops very easily would be attached to that sort of unit, going clear back to the Benjamin Rush bag. Here's another kind of throwback, the designs in here. Here we get a little bit of change, but you see these are still across the top here. These drops in here, and the drops, particularly the drops in this area, are supposed to be an older characteristic. You see the not quite bilateral symmetry, but yeah, but it pretty much is bilateral symmetry. Even though you change some color in here, the flowers in these areas are pretty much the same sort of thing. Notice the tabs in here are related to the designs up in here. Notice the repetition of designs in here. If it's not Winnebago, it's at least strongly influenced by the Winnebago sorts of way of going about building bags. Now here we're getting into something that's rather later. Notice the reduction in size of the panel up in here. You get this beaver tail design across in here. There's kind of a velveteen or silk or something of the sort. Floral designs. These are different as you go across the top up in here. But what I particularly want you to notice here is the degree to which this panel is expanding. The bilateral symmetry here is unusual. It's an unusual bag in many ways. But for that reason, interesting, it doesn't really fit in too well except by the increase in size of the beaded panel here. Now here's a couple of more bags. I like this bag particularly because you get the repetition of designs here, which strikes me as being a Winnebago. This offset in here among the northern bags is often said to be a Winnebago characteristic, though at least half of the well-documented Winnebago bags do not have that offset. You'll see they're taking the use of some of the drops in here. You have the woven drops in here, but they bear no relationship to this design. So it's kind of, again, a neat and enigmatic bag. But look, this panel up in here is very short, and over on this bag, it disappears entirely. You get a little bit of a tab in here, kind of marking that spot. But the increasing size of this decorative area is important. Now, one of the things, you get these big, heavy bead businesses down in here, is the bag starts to sag. So a lot of the times you'll find that bags, as you're getting into the early 20th century, are no longer really bags. They're just decorative panels. The tops are actually sewed together just so that you can't even put your hand into them. So they don't really bags at all. They're just decorative. These things are decorative things. Here's another bag, the same sort of thing. In this case, you can see we have a few of these turned up. The floral design, The horses in here makes me suspect that this bag is probably of Omaha production. Rather unusual shape in here. Bilateral symmetry across in here. Clearly not in the Chippewa sort of thing, but yet clearly they're picking up on the kind of style, the floral styles that were pioneered by the Chippewa. And you notice we now have our fully beaded across in here. That panel has completely disappeared. Again, panels completely disappeared. And also backward Chippewa sort of asymmetrical floral designs, and those are usually associated with Chippewa. You see that thing right in there? That's a hole. You can slip your hand into the bag. And fully beaded across in here. You're getting even more beads on these things. The increase in the quantity of beads is another feature which sort of tends to make things seem later. As just as on the Lakota sort of things in the Great Plains, the increasing quantity of beadwork, the increasing size of the zones is characteristic of later work as opposed to earlier work. Here we get bilateral symmetry across here. There's a handhold in here. Notice the size of this bag. This bag is even getting bigger now. You notice the beads that are on in here and go in various different directions. Applique work as opposed to weaving work. Feature up in here, you get the design differences that we saw in some of the earlier bags. By now you must recognize that pocket. Asymmetry, we find that much more frequently out here in the west than we do back in the Chippewa sorts of regions up in the upper Great Lakes. Potawatomi, but Chippewa predominantly. All right, that does it. That gives you a very brief overview of some of the artistic characteristics of bandolier bags and their change through time. And we always have to look at change through time because one of the mythologies about Indian art is that it's unchanging. Any living art style changes. And as I've demonstrated to you today, bandolier bags have changed through time, and that is a characteristic of a living artistic tradition. And the tradition is very much alive up through the 1930s. It is being somewhat recreated today, but this is one of the high points of Native American work from the southeast, from the upper Great Lakes, and from the eastern prairie regions. Now, if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to see what I can do with them. Yes?
I missed at the very beginning. Did you explain, you talked about 1827, so they began in the early part of the 19th century to make them, or did they make them historically for hundreds and hundreds of years?
Well, when we're talking about a bandolier bag, all we're really talking about is a bag that one wears over the shoulder. And it becomes a bandolier bag at some ill-defined point where it gets to be elaborately decorated. And I certainly don't think that people in 1826 or in 1770 when the Benjamin Rush bag was invented it at the time. What we're looking at is the continuation of a long artistic tradition, the change of materials as things became available. But above all, we're talking about the first data that we have. Yes, ma'am.
Were the geometric designs done on looms of some sort?
Yes.
And then the flowers come by hand?
Right. You're doing the applique work, and as in that one bag, you noticed that they were trying to do, they did floral designs on a loom woven stuff. Yes.
The designs have any cultural significance?
That opens a can of worms. Do you have a couple of hours? The origin of the floral designs certainly is not the kind of thing that was found in the very earliest pieces that we have collected. One of the explanations of it is we have sisters of something or other teaching Indians floral designs in missionary schools in Montreal back in the 1600s. We know that many Quaker ladies and devoted people of various religious schools came out and taught the Indians how to sew, how to cook, and so on in the American fashion. One of the things they were teaching was ornamentation. And you can't divorce what we're seeing in this Native American work from the period in which it was created. Remember, we're talking about the late Victorian era. We're talking about lots of beadwork in the late Victorian era. We're talking about lots of floral designs in the late Victorian era. And there are just enough images that I've been able to find of things like Victorian slippers that end up looking very much like some Indian moccasins of the period. So I suspect the floral designs are predominantly derived from European models, both directly through instruction and because it happened to be around. There's one lovely bandolier bag that I would like to have borrowed from the Railroad Museum down in Kansas City, which actually is a copy of an advertisement for a grapefruit or something like that, it would have been beautiful in terms of inspiration for the designs. In terms of the symbolism of these designs, I don't think that the bandolier bag designs have very much symbolism. And it's always necessary to distinguish between something that has meaning like a red light and something that has meaning like a cross. And from what little testimony, contemporary testimony is available from the late 19th and early 20th century, a lot of the interpretations of Native American art given by the Native Americans themselves, who manufactured it, is that it has significance that's more like a traffic light than like a cross. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could expand on the information about the beading competitions in the 19th and 20th centuries. Were these actual competitions?
There were state fairs in which prizes were awarded just as for jams and jellies. And well, yeah, they were competitions. It wasn't one woman sitting who could do it most rapidly, but it was certainly best in show kind of a thing, yeah.
Was it something particular to the Midwest, or did it happen throughout the United States?
Well, I don't know how big state fairs were in Virginia, but state and county fairs were certainly a big thing across the areas that I know best from Illinois westward. So it was a pretty characteristic thing, and it was just simply. Sometimes these were Indian fairs, but a lot of times they were simply fairs for anybody who happened to be there, and beadworking was just as competitive as pie making. Yes?
Do you know what kind of things in the earlier ones that were functional? Do you know what kind of things that people kept in their bags?
Well, there are a lot of different purposes for bags. One of the things you might keep in a bag would be things that might have some sort of religious significance to you. Different kinds of bags, you would put berries that you just picked. These might or might not be elaborated. You might put your smoking equipment in the bag. You might put whatever. It's a big pocket. So nearly anything would go in there. But these bandolier bags were show-off pieces. Often enough, you didn't carry anything in them, but you might wear 2 or 3 or 4 of them to show off what a good beadworker your wife was, how many people had given you gifts. I mean, these were ostentatious wares like going out for Easter Sunday and putting a new hat on and a new dress. If there are no other questions, I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today. It's been a pleasure, and I'm always glad to have the opportunity to talk about Native American art. Thank you.